President Theodore Roosevelt.
You know, I'm thoroughly disappointed that it wasn't a chocolate mousse tonight.
We had it last
Completely
week.
disappointed.
We had it last week, but I didn't care
Would
for
have
it.
been appropriate for tonight.
Yeah.
Welcome all of you this evening. By Godfrey, it's good to be here with you, especially after some 103 years after my corporal demise. I want to thank the Heritage Village Museum and my good friend Bill Dichtel for having this first person series. And I'm delighted to see all you history buffs here, because I believe that now it is more important to have an understanding of history than ever before. So our topic tonight is my reflections on the office of the president. During my lifetime, many momentous changes occurred. Rails and telegraphs spanned the country from east to west. The first transatlantic cable connected us to the old world. Automobiles, I had the first Stanley steamer in the White House. I couldn't do carpets with it. And I'm the first president to go up in an airplane and to go down in a submarine. Therefore, this proves that you can't put anything over me nor get under my skin. Now, telephones, phonographs, light bulbs, steam, electric, and diesel motors, Gatling, Maxim, and Browning machine guns. What possibly could go wrong? This was a pivotal moment in our history, and it took a firm hand and a clear vision to guide us into the future. As I have often stated, order without liberty and liberty without order are equally destructive. Now, there are numerous superlatives that come to mind to describe me. One of them is steamroller in pants, that damn cowboy, according to my detractors, and a moniker that I fully embrace. Trustbuster, big game hunter, reading as president, 2 books a day on average. I put the speed in reading. Writing as president, 40 books and 150,000 letters dictated to a sea of worn-out stenographers. Conservation president, colonel, my most beloved title. Fulfiller of all good intentions and hundreds more. Now, my first story should be of my rise to the presidency. I had a strong interest in military history as a boy. During the Civil War, I witnessed my father traveling to many Union camps to institute a program whereby soldiers could reserve an amount of pay to sustain their families back home. Now, both my uncles on my mother's side served as naval officers in the Confederacy. My mother often told me stories of their heroics. I also read copious amounts of books of historic and mythical heroes. By the time I entered Harvard, I was writing the complete history of the Naval War of 1812. Still a staple at Annapolis, I hear. Eventually, I became Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. I was at this time formulating what is now known as the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This advocated America's direct involvement in the affairs of other countries in our hemisphere. To that end, we had a long-standing grievance with Spain concerning Cuba. Now, President McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana Harbor to show our flag there. Many of you might know of the tragic explosion that sunk the Maine and resulted in great loss of life. In my position as Assistant Secretary, I took the opportunity when Secretary Long went out for the day to telegraph Admiral Dewey in the Far East to coal up and prepare to engage the Spanish, who were then anchored in Manila Harbor in case war should be declared. Now, Secretary Long and the President were furious with me. However, the order stood as public sentiment for war was overwhelming. I privately said to the President that he had all the backbone of a chocolate eclair. When he finally declared war, I offered and was granted permission to raise the first U.S. voluntary cavalry, and we became fondly known as Roosevelt's Rough Riders. And my good friend Leonard Wood took command, as I still needed some experience. We raised men from the Eastern schools, sportsmen, sons of industrialists, Western cowboys, Native Americans. They are the best of American manhood from sea to shining sea. For the first time since the Civil War, we are united in a common cause under one banner. Our cry is, remember the Maine to hell with Spain. Now, I took a line from a poem by Sir Walter Scott. And that line is, one crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name. My crowded hour was the taking of Kettle and San Juan Heights. And when I returned from Cuba, I was hailed a hero. Thereafter, I was tapped for the governorship of New York. The politics there were deeply corrupt. Of course, some things never change. At this time, they sought to retain power using my reform-minded and anti-corruption reputation. The voters remembered the war hero in my cleaning house as an NYPD police commissioner. However, when my reforms became a reality, the political bosses panicked, and they urged President McKinley to bump me up into vice presidential obscurity. As a man of action, this was a terrible outcome for me. However, when President McKinley was suddenly assassinated, I was sworn in as president. I said that I rose like a rocket, and within 38 months of the charge of San Juan Heights, I had become president. Now, you might remember one of my most famous refrains, speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far. Our big stick is our Navy. Mediating the Japanese-Russo War as president raised in my mind the specter of one day having to face Japan in an awful war. I felt we had taken possession of what they coveted the most. That's the Philippines. This wasn't the only time I used America's power and prestige to negotiate a settlement. In 1902, Venezuela found itself in default of its debt to England and Germany, and the latter informed me of its intention to collect that debt. Blockading and shelling the customs house in San Carlos, the German Navy's actions were reminiscent of similar strategies used to extract concessions from China during the Boxer crisis. I informed the Kaiser that if they were not going to enter arbitration at The Hague, that Admiral Dewey would have a short run from their training grounds near Puerto Rico. And they would attack the German fleet then off of Venezuela. I further explained that to travel from Germany to reinforce their navy was a much greater distance than our eastern naval ports. Strengthening our navy allowed us to project our interest outside our hemisphere. Having our great white fleet sail around the world was a sign that America's interest would and could be defended worldwide. Now, my strategic thinking extended to the need to have a canal in Central America, thereby reducing over 8,000 nautical miles travel from the east and west coasts for our Navy. With great effort, despite Congress, I got it done, and a bully fine canal it remains to this day. Now, as some of you might have noticed, I have with me my little friend. He is affectionately known as Teddy's Bear. Some of you have expressed an interest in the story of his creation. In 1902, at the beginning of my first term as president, I was asked to mediate a border dispute between Mississippi and Louisiana concerning the harvesting of shellfish. Now, there is something you must know about me. There is very often an ulterior motive involved in my endeavors, and that is a bear hunt in the cane brakes of the Mississippi Delta. Now, this native cane can grow up to 10, 20 feet in height and is virtually impassable, and is home to hundreds and thousands of bears and panthers and all manner of wildlife. This was almost the last place one could hunt the black bear. I was met at the train station, by my guide, Holkaya, who as a former slave at the age of 10, shot his first bear. Over his lifetime, he would shoot more than 3,000 bears, more than Boone and Crockett combined. I was most fortunate to have him as my guide. Now, as the hunt proceeded, Collier placed myself and a companion in a blind to await his driving a bear in our direction. Now, listening to the fading bay of his dogs in the distance, my companion and I finally decided to return to camp for some sustenance. Meanwhile, unbeknownst, Holt had returned with a large sow bear. The bear reared up and killed one of his beloved dogs. As we were nowhere in sight, Holt was forced to rush in and knock the bear out with his rifle. Having bent the barrel, he had to resort to tying the wounded and stunned animal to a fallen tree. Calling me back from camp, I had to decline as unsportsmanlike the killing of a straying quarry. As a man of action, this method of hunting with packs of dogs and driving prey to a waiting hunter was seemed counter to the strenuous physical challenge to which I was accustomed. At my behest, one of my companions then dispatched the wounded, bleeding bear with a knife. As you can imagine, news of this event traveled fast. Cartoonist Clifford Berryman of the Washington Post produced this wildly popular cartoon of the incident, making special note of my inability to draw the line in the proper instance. Now, Rose and Morris Mitchum, New York toy makers, were then inspired to create what we all know as the teddy bear. I approved of and even adopted their bear as my 1904 Republican campaign mascot. Now, as an interesting side note, at the end of my second term, my friend and hand-picked successor, President William Howard Taft, a man from these parts, wanted a mascot of his own. So due to the president's fondness for possum on his dinner plate, his followers created Billy the Possum. As a result, possum meat increased in price tenfold during his administration. It's possum inflation, I would say. However, Billy the Possum faded into obscurity, never having achieved the stature of Teddy's bear. By the way, the dispute between Louisiana and Mississippi concerning the state fishing boundaries was eventually resolved by their respective legislatures. Now, concerning the hunt, however, never let it be said that I was selfish. After all, it was always about shellfish. Having concluded my second term as president, I embarked on my notable and much vaunted African safari, or as I like to say, scientific expedition. I needed to get away as well to give Will Taft room to be president. After all, when a certain journalist described his meeting with me, he stated that he needed to go home and wring my personality out of his clothing. The expedition was financed in part by the Smithsonian Institute and Andrew Carnegie. At the outset of my trip, you might remember J.P. Morgan, and he was reported to say, while raising a glass, that, don't laugh at this, America expects that every lion will do his duty. My expedition was almost a year in duration, collecting over 11,000 specimens, of which the majority went to the Smithsonian. The bulk of animals were used to feed the over 200 camporters, hauling amongst other things 2 tons of salt to preserve the skins. Now, one of the worst travails that we faced was being assailed by thousands of ticks being picked off ourselves, as well as our horses, on a nightly basis. And that's nothing. When we shot the animals, they were covered in ticks also. So concluding this topic, I would like to state unequivocally that game butchery is as objectionable as any other form of wanton cruelty or barbarity. But to protest against hunting of game is a sign of softness of the head, not soundness of the heart. Following the safari, Mrs. Roosevelt joined me in touring Europe, primarily to receive my 1906 Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the end to the Russo-Japanese War. Now, meeting many heads of state, I shared with Mrs. Roosevelt that if I should meet another king, I should bite him. Now, to truly understand me as conservation president, you need to go back to the time of my youth. Now, being a sickly, asthmatic child, I was tutored at home, and my main interest, one of them, was natural history. My uncle Rob Roosevelt was already a renowned naturalist, and in part was responsible for my pursuit therein. I went about creating in my room the Theodore Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. As I got older, there were frequent hunting trips, some of which were to collect specimens that were of great interest to me. Entering Harvard, I came to realize that natural history as taught there was not focused on the field work that I so loved, but in a laboratory which to me was of no interest. Now, embarking in 1883 on my first hunting trip out to the Dakota Territory, a place I say that the romance of my life began, was sparked by a conversation with a naval man, the business associate of my Uncle James, Commodore Henry Honeychurch Garnish. Additionally, his being an investor in the Dakota Territory also piqued my interest. As a result, we planned a hunting trip. I knew that the Wild West was quickly disappearing, and I still wanted to hunt a bison, North America's largest mammal. Now, Gorringe, however, was not able to join me, so I went alone. The first night, stepping off the train station onto the platform at the Little Missouri, which nowadays does not exist, from what I understand. It's across the Little Missouri from the town of Medora, which you should all go and visit. I found lodging at the Pyramid Park Hotel, of which Garnish, by the way, was part owner. So I had to spend my first night amongst liquored up cowboys and bedbugs. Now, I was fortunately able to hire a local guide by the name of Joe Ferris for the long, as it turned out, 3-week hunt. He at first thought of me as an Eastern dude, 4 eyes, storm windows, of dubious moral fiber. But over time, he realized there was much more to me than that. And during the trip, I witnessed and spoke with those that shared stories with me that from the Dakota Territory to Wyoming, they were never out of the sight of the bones of bison. This was the beginning of my awareness of the finite gifts God has entrusted to us in nature. So to that end, on July 4th, 1886, in my speech in Dickinson, Dakota Territory, in Pod, I stated that no people were ever yet benefited by riches if their property corrupted their virtue. I would more and more come to believe that those who sought to enrich themselves without concerns for future generations of Americans needed to have limitations placed on them. In my opinion, it is incumbent on the government to be the good steward of our natural treasures. When Congress placed limitations on my power to designate natural parks and forests in an essential agricultural bill, I met with Gifford Pinchot, the first head of the United States Forest Service. Now, we spread out maps on the Oval Office floor, and in the 10 days before I had to sign that bill, I designated no less than 16 million acres of national forest. There was nothing Congress could do about it. During my presidency, I used my authority to establish no less than 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, and I don't have enough fingers for the 18 national monuments. That, by my reckoning, comes to 230 million acres of public land. That's 84,000 acres for every day of my presidency. When Congress refused to protect the Grand Canyon, I made the 2 Walls national monuments and the river a game preserve. 10 years later, in all their wisdom, Congress finally made it a national park. That is why I often say that Congress is the opposite of progress. As for my stance on patriotism, for me, every day is celebrated as the 4th of July. One of my most notable quotes on patriotism is as follows. Patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president. It is patriotic to serve him insofar as he efficiently serves the country. It is unpatriotic not to oppose him to the exact extent that by inefficiency or otherwise he fails in his duty to stand by the country. It is unpatriotic not to tell the truth about the president or anyone else. I believe this quote has stood the test of time. In addition, I believe that if you could kick the person in the pants responsible for most of your trouble, you would not sit for a month. Don't try it. This would be a great time to share a few anecdotes attributed to me by my children. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, my eldest daughter, said of me, "Father wants to be the baby at every baptism, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral." Not to be outdone, my son Theodore Jr. said of me that Father's coffee mug is more in the nature of a bathtub. I am most likely the most caffeinated president in history, at about a gallon a day. This habit stems from childhood, when strong coffee was used as an elixir for my asthma. At my home in Oyster Bay at Sagamore Hill, I and our 6 children, Mrs. Roosevelt says she has 7, we enjoy all manner of physical activity. My favorite is the point-to-point hike. The only rule is you cannot go around something, you must go either over, under, or through it. Now, carrying on this tradition to the White House, the French ambassador was along for the hike. When we came to a stream, I proceeded to strip off my clothes, holding them above my head. I noticed the ambassador still had on his lavender gloves. When I inquired as to why he kept them on, he answered, "Just in case on the other side we were to meet some ladies." Delightful! As a small boy with serious asthma, my father, the best man I ever knew, told me one day, "Theodore, you have the mind but not the body. Without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. It is hard drudgery to make one's body, but I know you will do it." From then on, it's been my life's goal to make my body, sometimes a little bit too much, and seek action. I believe that black care rarely sits behind the rider whose pace is fast enough. I worked out on the rings and the parallel bars. I learned boxing. As it turns out, a passion that served me well at Harvard and in the Dakota Territory. Sadly, this came to an end in the White House in 1908. A sharp right hook by a young lieutenant left me partially blind in my left eye. However, many things in life have a silver lining. During my 1912 Bull Moose Party campaign stop in Milwaukee, I was shot stepping out of my limousine. Needing larger typeset for my speeches as a result of my reduced vision, I had 50 pages folded over in my breast pocket. And that in part was to save my life. I went on to give that speech for 90 minutes, exclaiming that "You may not know it, but I have been shot. But it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Concluding, I was quickly transported to the hospital. Now, my Bull Moose Party candidacy was groundbreaking in many ways. For example, we championed women's suffrage, workmen's compensation, 8-hour workday, farm relief, all based on my square deal policy of equal opportunity for every American. Definitely not equal outcomes, however. We still remain the third party receiving the greatest amount of votes. Sadly, splitting the Republican Party gave the election to Woodrow Wilson, a coward and intellectual snob as far as I was concerned. I felt that this time, unlike so many times before, my political career was truly over. So I decided to get away for a speaking engagement in South America. While I was there, I was informed that Brazil's version of Lewis and Clark, Colonel Mariano Rondon was to lead an expedition to explore what was then called the River of Doubt. I told Mrs. Roosevelt this was my last chance to be a boy. Now, taking my son Kermit with me, as Mrs. Roosevelt insisted I had a chaperone, I took almost a month to just reach the headwaters to begin our journey. We encountered rapids, hostile natives, murder, starvation, injury, and disease. At one point, I asked Kermit to leave me, as there was no way that he would make it out alive if he had to drag me along with him. I lost over 50 pounds. I also re-injured my leg that I originally received in an accident, in a carriage accident in 1902. Our doctor operated on my leg with a penknife, and I completely lost the sight in my left eye. We finally emerged alive, and the Brazilians subsequently renamed the river Rio Roosevelt. Now, returning, at the outset of World War I took it upon myself to campaign loudly and often concerning America's unpreparedness for war. I called President Wilson a coward for not going to war over the sinking of the Lusitania. I said to my son Kermit that Wilson was that lily-livered skunk in the White House. War had already been raging since 1914. Finally, on the 6th of April, 1917, Wilson finally declared war. My 4 sons joined, as well as my daughter, Ethel Roosevelt Derby. She joined the ambulance service, and her husband was also a surgeon with the American Expeditionary Force, and so she wanted to join him. On July 14th, 1918, my youngest son, Quentin, was up flying with the 95th Reconnaissance Squadron, and he was beset by 3 German aircraft and was killed. So I'm going to shift to not being Roosevelt for a moment, because this part doesn't suit to do that. So I want to share this with you. So Quentin is the only child of a president to be killed in action. When asked of his service, he would use one of his favorite expressions, noblesse oblige, or noble obligation, or biblically stated, to those that much is given, much is expected. When his death was announced and used in German propaganda, it had unintended consequences. The German people knew and highly respected the president, and seeing his sons fighting and dying while the Kaiser's sons were, in, as we say nowadays, in the rear with the gear, had a marked impact on their morale. When asked, Mrs. Roosevelt said of her children that, "We can't expect them to act as sparrows when we have raised them to be like eagles." After the war, Mrs. Roosevelt had a fountain built in the town square of Cambrai, near where Quentin was killed. It is inscribed with a quote from his father, "Only those that are fit to live who do not fear to die." Now, the president died on January 6, 1919, in his sleep at about 4 in the morning. The cause of his death officially was pulmonary embolism. Now, previous to this, at Christmas, he was hospitalized, and he suffered from rheumatoid arthritis as well as repeated parasitic infections from his time in Cuba and in Brazil. Now, Quentin's death had a profound impact and certainly contributed to his decline. It was said of him that had he been awake, death itself would have been in for a fight. And shortly before his death, he said to his dear Edith that, "I don't know if you will ever know how much I love Sagamore Hill." Now, as your 25th president, I gave a speech in France at the Sorbonne on the 23rd of April, 1910, entitled Citizenship in a Republic. This most often quoted section has come to be known as the man in the arena, and it sums up my view of life. It is not the critic who counts. It is not the man that points out how the strong man stumbles, nor how the doer of deeds might have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again. For there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who actually strives to do the deeds, knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause. and who in the end, at best, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. Now, I have lived a life more full than any 9 men that I know. I only ask of you that you keep your eyes on the stars and your feet firmly planted on the ground. Fully delighted to have given you this speech, ladies and gentlemen. Do you have any questions? Not you. Yes, Senator.
Did you not?
I did.
Were you not awarded the Nobel Prize for something, the treaty?
Nobel Peace Prize for the Russo-Japanese War.
Oh, very good.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Also received the Medal of Honor from someone by the name of William Jefferson Clinton, I do believe. Took a great while to get it. I got it eventually. Does anyone have any questions about any of the different parts of Roosevelt's life?
You want to talk about the Brownsville Affair?
Not particularly. It's not the critical counts. You just want me to stumble, I know. So the Brownsville Affair, well, there were a group of Black American soldiers that were in Brownsville, Texas. And at that time, as you probably know, there was a great deal of racism and there were lynchings. And so the black troops were not being, now keep in mind that some of these men had fought alongside Roosevelt in San Juan. I mean, these guys were the ones that actually went up San Juan Hill because Roosevelt's troops went up Kettle Hill. And then he joined them. And they were led by a fellow that you just might know. John Joseph Pershing was the leader of those troops. And they called him Blackjack as a result of that because he led black troops. So these troops were in Brownsville, Texas. And they were being treated abysmally by the local populace. Now, for some reason, something happened. There's never been any proof that any of the troops did this. And I've read deeply into Roosevelt's musings over this. Now, Roosevelt was a person that once he did something, he was not going to go back. I don't care what. He was a bulldog stubborn. And so when it was reported to him that none of the troops would fess up to killing these 2 white men, killing one and wounding another in town. There was no proof that they ever left there. Their white officers said they never left their barracks, so it may have been a setup. But Roosevelt had reported to him that these men wouldn't fess up. So he said, well, we're just going to cashier all of them. Now, the fact that it's reported that some of them were Medal of Honor winners is erroneous. There were none of them that were Medal of Honor winners within that group. However, these men, this was their only opportunity to make a living in the world, so it was an awful thing to do. And Will Taft later was very upset as vice president with the president when it finally came out that it was questionable whether they were guilty. However, there were so many things that went on. One of the first things the president did is he invited a black man into the White House. But the problem with that was not that he invited a black man to the White House, because they had been there many times before. It's just that he invited him to dinner. And that, in those days, equated to he was equal to the white man. And so the Southerners just tore him up. So he was very, very, he was kind of stuck. But if you look at his record in his entirety, there was, and I don't recall her name, but there was a black postmistress down, I believe, in Texas or Mississippi, I'm not sure where. But she was being beset by all these white people down there that, she just doesn't belong there. Roosevelt said, fine, you want to be that way, great. We'll continue to pay her. And now you guys can go pick up your mail 30 miles away at another post office. And he closed it. And there are many anecdotal stories of Roosevelt and Alice Roosevelt Longworth that show that they were not prejudiced. They definitely did believe in the square deal. I mean, when Roosevelt's wife and mother died, I don't know if you know, on February 14th, he had enough juice still to go to the convention in Chicago, the Republican convention, national convention. The person that he asked to lead the convention was a black man. Again, I don't recall his name. However, if he was that much of a racist, then he would have not done that. So he had a lot of trouble. In fact, in his 1904 re-election campaign, he didn't win a single state in the South, not a single state. So, yeah. You want to add to that?
No.
Remember, he loved possum. Loved possum.
I know, I completely understand.
Thank God they kept butter so he could get out of his bathtub too.
Oh, don't even start.
No, this lady works down at the Taft, what is it? It's not the museum, it's the,
I work at the William Howard Taft National Historic Site.
right, so she knows William Howard Taft, and I will tell you this much, that Will Taft was an incredibly gentle, loving person. And Roosevelt brought him up and encouraged him to be with him. They were like two brothers. They were two buddies. And what Roosevelt did when he came back from Africa to Will Taft was unconscionable, it was awful. Will Taft was known to break out in tears over this breakup of this relationship. Now, years later, in much later years, the two inadvertently met at a restaurant. And when the two of them shook hands and were together, the entire restaurant broke out in applause because they knew how sad that whole story was. Am I telling it somewhat?
What happened?
At the restaurant?
No, why did they break?
Oh my goodness, I mean, they split. Roosevelt was just talking complete trash about Taft. When he came, while he was in Africa, the one reason I don't mention in this speech is there was another reason. Roosevelt wanted to get away to give Taft his room to be president. However, he was getting, and he didn't want any reporters next to him. So he felt that his word, he'd be intruding on Taft. But he kept getting these reports because Will Taft was a man in his own right and he wanted to run the country a little bit differently. He was not as, I have spoken a number of times about how he treated other people. It was his way or the highway. Well, Will Taft was not that way. He was more of he was a lawyer in training. He became a Supreme Court justice. That's all he wanted. And Roosevelt drug him into the vice presidency and presidency. So, long story short, he had a different temperament, and Roosevelt just wouldn't stand for it. So,
William was never vice president. He was his secretary of war.
Secretary of War, yeah, in the Philippines. He killed lots of people.
He was the governor of the Philippines.
Yeah.
He was the governor of...
But he was Secretary of War under
Secretary of War,
Roosevelt.
yeah.
Governor of the Philippines, where he killed lots of people. I'm just, yes.
Mr. President, would you talk to us about your days as a police commissioner in New York? Republican bosses and Tammany Hall and Stephen Crane.
Yeah, the Democrats ran Tammany Hall in those days, but when I became police commissioner, the police department was very, very corrupt. And I would sneak around at night in disguise. The cartoons of the time show great big teeth and glasses because I'd sneak up on the policemen that were asleep and call them into my office the next day and give them what for. Now, the trouble in those days were that there were many laws on the books, and the one most notable one was that you were not allowed to have alcohol served on Sundays. So what the barkeepers did is they paid people police to look the other way and have the bars, because the German workers, they worked 6 days a week, and that was their only day to have a beer, and they wanted to have a beer. So, because Roosevelt believed, or I believed as president, I believed as police commissioner, that the law was on the books, so it had to be followed. And so I said, hey, this isn't going to stand anymore. You either have the law or you change the law, but I'm going to enforce it. And the Germans got so upset, they actually had a parade. They dared Roosevelt to show up. So Roosevelt shows up there, and they say, where is Roosevelt? And Roosevelt said, here is thine Roosevelt. And so they gave him a lot of credit because he showed up there. But, as I point out in my speech, the political bosses in New York despised him because he was a reformer. When he was up in Albany as a state legislator, and then later when he was police commissioner, and they just had to get rid of him. And they threatened McKinley and said, you're gonna have to take him as vice president. And McKinley already knew what he was getting into because of what happened in the Spanish-American War. But he was so popular, there was nothing they could do. The Republican Party was in real trouble. It was very corrupt at the time. So, yeah, as was Tammany Hall for the Democrats. That's why I say in my speech that some things never change in New York politics. So. Any other? Yes?
I'm just curious, you kind of mentioned your bull
Old
stubbornness.
Moose Party.
How do you think your attitude affected your children's lives? If it did? Like,
Well, as I was saying, what Mrs. Roosevelt said, they were raised like eagles. You know, they were to serve. And it was, as Quentin would say, noble obligation, because their father did so much. I mean, that man did more in an hour than we would do in a month. I mean, he was just, and it wasn't just the caffeine, he was hyperactive. I mean, reading 2 books on average a day, he'd hide them in the flower pots in front of the White House doors. Yeah. And his kids, they were very spirited. They took ponies upstairs in the house and threw snowballs on policemen, and they were called the White House Gang. Quentin led the White House Gang, so yeah. So, no, they were very spirited children, believe it or not. And of course, you do know that Theodore Jr. also, he's the only, that's the only group of president and son that got the Medal of Honor, both of them. He was completely disabled in the First World War, 100%. Now, if any of you ever watched the movie The Longest Day, ever seen that? So, who is it, Ford? Who is it? Fonda. Henry Fonda plays the part of Theodore Roosevelt Sr. Now, he landed on D-Day with his troops. He had to fight to get there because he was totally disabled. He came with his cane, came down the shingle, and led the troops, and he got the Medal of Honor for that. But 5 days after that, he suffered a fatal heart attack and died. Now, Quentin, as I mentioned, was buried at that time in Sharon, where his plane crashed, where he was shot. And so after the war, they disinterred him and put him next to his elder brother in Normandy at the grave. So if you go to Normandy, you'll find the 2 side by side there. And all of them served. In fact, the daughter, as I said, the daughter did too. She was in the ambulance corps because her husband was a surgeon. So they all, and the other children, the other girls, they worked at home, as did Edith, as did Theodore. He worked very, very hard once we were in the war to, tell people that, hey, now we gotta, but I've read things in World War II about books where he talks about America's continual unpreparedness for war. Because if you ever have an opportunity to read a little bit about what happened in the Spanish-American War, they actually had to sneak in and grab the ship. It wasn't even the Rough Rider ship. They had to grab it before the other troops were supposed to get on board, because Roosevelt wanted to get into it. So they got the ship, and then when they came into the harbor in Cuba, they didn't even have a proper way to get the horses out. So one of Roosevelt's 2 horses went out to sea and drowned. The other one went inland. So many horses, they were completely unprepared. He had to sneak out with Pershing. They had to sneak out and steal food from the army in order to feed the troops. And then the reason that he did not get the Medal of Honor, because he worked very hard to get it, was because he made a fool of the army, because they were not quick enough to get our troops out of Cuba, and guys were dying of yellow fever. And they didn't need to be sick, and malaria, that's where he got malaria also. But there was a very, very, I'll let you read about it. There's too much there to just talk about in a short stint. Any other questions? No? Are you done with me? Oh, I'm done with you, yes.
So you mentioned Pinchot,
Yes?
so what about Pinchot and Ballinger?
Well, Pinchot hated Will Taft. The reason is that Will Taft was not as, there's a story, I tell about all the safaris, right, and the culling of animals, but Roosevelt founded the Boone and Crockett Club, which was a club, it was said of him that, well, we call him nowadays Roosevelt was a tree hugger. He loved trees, he loved nature. because he was a naturalist. That's how he started his life. And so it was very natural that Gifford Pinchot, a naturalist, would be drawn to him. And as I mentioned, Roosevelt was very cavalier about getting all these national parks. Well, that really upset a lot of the people, because when he went out to the Dakotas earlier in his life, before the presidency, he said that had he not been out there, he never would have been president. But the Western people despised him because he turned all these thousands of acres of land into national parks and into, well, how do I put this? Yellowstone was overrun with you know, hotels and bars and God knows what else they had out there. Roosevelt cleared all that out because he believed that Yellowstone should be for the people for the future. And William Taft didn't serve that. And one of the reasons that Roosevelt came back after his safari was because he was receiving reports from Pinchot how much Will Taft wasn't sticking to the line of Roosevelt's conservation. So.
You know, knowing that he's such a conservationist in today's world, if you think, if he was here today, do you think he would still be a big game hunter, or do you have a different attitude?
No, as I stated in the speech, he believed that well, look, he saw what had happened with the bison out west, right? And the story they don't tell you is the reason it took him so long to hunt is because previous 2 weeks, unbeknownst to him, the Army and some hired guns went out and killed over 6,000 buffalo in that area, because the deal was that you want to kill all the buffalo, that would take care of the Indians. That's how they subjugated the Indians. They killed their food off. And so they just slaughtered them. So he believed from early on as a naturalist to collect specimens. That's what they did in those days. Today he'd probably be more of a photographer, but he still wanted to hunt. And he would probably still go on safaris, because today the Safari Club and the Boone and Crockett Club and all those groups, they're the ones that fund all these natural preserves for animals, because they don't want to see them killed. Otherwise they would be wiped out. They wouldn't be around, because we've taken over the planet. So I still believe that he very much would have been for the proper culling of animals. I mean, you have this problem, for example, just recently in Australia with this overrunning of millions of, like a mouse plague. Nature has to be balanced out. So, we're reintroducing the wolves, and that's creating problems. And Roosevelt believed in killing them all. So, yeah. Further expound on anything for you? I'll make something up if you like.
Good job.
So I believe dessert is served, right, Bill? Chocolate mousse?
Full news.
If you want chocolate mousse, just pull out the peanuts. That was Jimmy Carter's thing.
You want a picture? Yeah. If you're done, you want me to get a picture?
I gotta make sure it's Is he hiding?
It went down slower. I hope it wasn't until
Oh yeah, sure. I'm gonna put my hat on. I should tell you. You know why I have a compass?
No.
So I can tell you where to go.
He's the president.
Grab that chair and sit in there.
Oh, okay. Have read my.
There you go.
Very good.
Oops, sorry, Patty.
Very good.
It wouldn't worth the money though, was it? We could have got it for free at your house.
be, but
No,
Thank you.
I think you'd have made too many stops at our house.
Huh?
You'd have stopped too often too. During,
Oh, I know, because Patty kept
Speak to our house.
asking questions.
Absolutely.
It was terrible. I lost my mojo, man. She's a mojo killer. Mojo killer.
you did good.
Well, thank you. I stumbled a couple times, but hey.